Take it away, Nix.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to talk about Anne Rice archives and the specific impact that archives have on the history of New Orleans and generally the history of creative work. To begin, I would like to generally just give everyone an overview of what an archive is, what archival processing is, and some of the challenges in processing the collection before switching over into talking about Anne's research process and her specific ways of engaging her own creative work. So an archive is a place where people can go to gather firsthand facts, data, and evidence from manuscripts, letters, reports, notes, photographs, and other sort of primary sources. Archival collections are generally gathered from one person, one group, one organization, or one kind of like overarching institution in terms of our government. But they also may represent a family, which is the case for the Anne Rice collection, in that it encompasses both Anne's creative process, Stan Rice's creative process, and also Alice Borchart's creative process, and the ways in which all of their creative work sort of overlaps and intersects. So when we talk about archival processing, we're really talking about what it means to preserve and house these documents, and also these may be, digital files or audio recordings or, many different ways of recording information, but inevitably we're looking to gain a sense of how the collection comes to us in terms of condition and what is needed for the preservation of the collection. And then we also are then going through and trying to get a sense of how the creator or the sort of governing body of the collection documents itself. And provides evidence of historical events, of creative processes for the case of Anne Rice, and just other aspects of the history of the creator and of the organization. So with Anne's collection, we acquired the collection through the generous donation of Stuart Rose and the Stuart Rose Family Foundation, which gave us the opportunity to house Anne's materials in, like her city of origin, which is really amazing in that researchers are now going to be able to specifically relate the built environment of New Orleans to Anne's work and be able to make those connections. Whereas if this had been housed in California, for example, some of the resonances of New Orleans may not have been as present. So the Anne Rice collection itself is a combination of three specific authors, Anne Rice, Stan Rice, and her sister Alice Borchardt, and documents their professional development as writers and also their personal lives that sort of coincide with their writing. Rice's collection is one of the largest manuscript collections at Tulane libraries, and it illustrates her immersion in and engagement with the culture of New Orleans from a young age and all the way through her adulthood. So the collection is essentially about 90% manuscript material. And if you put the acquisition itself back to back, it would encompass half a football field. So we're looking at a lot of paper material, but we are also getting into like a lot of manuscript material in terms of like the drafts of her novels and her research materials and everything that she sort of needs to build the worlds that she is creating. But we are also getting into the impact of Anne on her fans and just generally like the world of publishing. So we are able to see correspondence from her publishers talking about how her work is promoted and marketed. We're able to get firsthand letters from her fans about the impact that she has made on their lives. We're also able to, see how people are subscribing to her newsletter, her fan club, and just generally engaging with the world that she's creating. In terms of her personal materials, we're getting into her diaries. She was a prolific diarist, and in the collection, we have like 210 of her handwritten diaries, which specifically not only document sort of her day-to-day life as a college student through becoming an internationally best-selling novelist, but also getting into all of the projects that she is working on and just generally her thought process in getting into these novels. And so we're really able to see all of the projects that Anne has sort of like put forth, but also all the projects that she just never went forward with. And also in the collection, we have many of her early works and concepts, which are unseen and unproduced and unpublished. So we really get to see the ways in which Anne is working on essentially 5 different projects at any given time. And she is constantly reassessing what it means to, like create a specific project. In that a lot of her projects are sort of related to the same themes and are also specifically working towards some of the same goals and intentions. And so while many of her projects did not come to fruition, you see the same sort of like thematic arc of her career in looking at both her published works and the works that did not get published. We also have a lot of personal records from her elementary school through collegiate years, her personal correspondence with her family and friends, which sort of helps undergird her career in that she's also just managing many relationships with people and is constantly showing how her career affects her personal life. And then we are also have collected her business records, which essentially talk about her tours in the Garden District of New Orleans, her ability to like merchandise and through dolls, through comic books, through many different aspects that go beyond the world of her novels to really influence her work. And then in regard to her husband's and her sister's materials, we have similarly their manuscripts, their audio recordings, and things that would specifically relate to their creative processes and how Anne also affects their creative processes. So the challenges of processing a collection that is this large is just the sheer volume of material in many different formats by different creators. So as I said before, if you put Rice's archival material back to back, it would span half a football field. And this means that while there is a large amount of manuscript material, there are unique formats like digital files, drawings and collages, audio recordings on cassettes, her diaries, and just many different aspects that require a different set of preservation interventions. Similarly related to that is the unique position of Tulane Special Collections as a department. We have only recently come together as one archival division. So we have unique collecting units like the Louisiana Research Collection, the Hogan Archive of New Orleans Music and New Orleans Jazz, Rare Books, the Southeastern Architectural Archive, and University Archives. And when we merge together as one whole division, we are looking to create overarching goals, management tools, and preservation standards, whereas before, each unit sort of managed itself. And one of the largest things that came out of this was the creation of a newly formed collection management team to sort of facilitate this new focus on preservation, quality control, and just generally like best practices for our collections across the board. So in this context, the Rice collection became an opportunity to really drill down on what procedures we wanted to implement across the board and really think holistically about what is needed to preserve our collections into the future. And then lastly, we also had a lot of pandemic and hurricane related delays. So obviously the shutdown of 2020 to slow the spread of the coronavirus and Hurricane Ida would separate me physically from the collection. So I could not work on it. But also we had like COVID exposures and isolation periods. We had to really identify the need for new supplies along with delays in shipments because of just not having materials on hand. And just like the challenges of working in a hybrid work environment where it wasn't guaranteed that my colleagues would be on site to review the materials or offer feedback. And so we started also reshaping our sense of communication with each other and adding in more documentation to ensure that we were all sort of on the same page about what is happening with the collection and where we're going with the collection, and also how this collection would influence the labeling of future collections, and other preservation interventions in future collections. So this was an opportunity for us to really prepare for future processing projects and iron out the ways in which Rice was both a unique collection in its size and scope, and also kind of similar to all the collections that we have on campus. So when it comes to Rice's research process about New Orleans, she approaches it from many different angles. One angle is that she is combing through the University of California, Berkeley's library, and she's checking out multiple books, academic articles, related novels, and theses. And not only is she reading all of these things and sort of taking it in, but she's also documenting the resources that she's using and organizing them by topic. So when she's studying New Orleans, she is looking into like the physical landscape, plantation layouts, clothes and furnishings, free people of color, yellow fever, for example. So she's trying to she's seeking to gain an overall sense of the social relations, race relations, and the development of New Orleans and Cane River, as compared to free people of color communities in other American port cities, such as Charleston. And she sort of snakes her way throughout the entire 18th century to settle more squarely on the early 18th century through the 1860s. So after having gone through all of these resources, she is writing what she calls beer raps. These are handwritten and typescript notes to herself about characterization, plot, and the challenges of integrating her research with her own intentions for her works. And so it's really amazing to see her go through either sitting at her house or in different bars in the city and different bars in California, such as, a bar directly outside of the Squaw Valley writing community. She's really consistently talking to herself about her novels and sort of squaring away the information that she needs to write her novels, and really trying to gain a sense of, her overall flow. And the sort of third tactic that she uses for research is just immersion. So when she is researching New Orleans, she is going through the French Quarter, she's going through the Irish Channel, and she's really trying to square the historic architecture, the climate and the physical layout, and also different aspects of the city with what she has read. And she also uses her Interview with the Vampire advance to take a trip to Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1977, and really also does the same squaring of the overall layout of Haiti with her conceptualization of Haiti that she's gotten from her books. And so in all three of these ways, Rice is really essentially reconceptualizing what it means to do research. And she's not solely relying on historians or primary resources. She is also following her own specific sense of what makes sense for her characters, what makes sense for just the ways in which she is conceptualizing her characters. And while her historical research definitely influences the sort of background of her characters, she really sort of stays true to the original characterization of most of her characters, only really enhancing them by, supplementing it with historical research and a historical background. And I also wanted to share a quote that I think speaks to what Anna's seeking to do in her novels overall. So she, in being deeply inspired by Russian and English novelists, is talking about how she wants to hit the essential dream, where you need no furniture, the edges disintegrate, the characters are as real and exaggerated as those of a dream. Only this dream is compact, truly meaningful, and utterly essential. And so essentially what Anna's doing in her research process is cutting out anything that she does not see as utterly essential to her process. And while the historical research is a undergirding of everything that Anne seeks to do in ensuring that New Orleans is properly represented and that New Orleans as a place comes through holistically and truly. She also knows that she needs to follow her own drum and follow her own sense of self. And to get to the essential dream, you also have to not only be able to integrate your research into your work, but you also have to essentially have a dream. You have to have a dream of what your work means and what it could mean to audiences, what it could mean to different people. And Anne essentially is studying history and studying craft to specifically break it, to specifically break the boundaries of what any of this means. Thank you for listening.
So I'm just going to start throwing you those questions. So the first couple of questions are for Nix. So the first question is, where are the Anne Rice archives located and what are the hours that the public could view Anne Rice's work?
The Anne Rice archives are located at Tulane University Special Collections, which is a division of Tulane Libraries. It's specifically part of the Louisiana Research Collection, which is a collection of like a collecting unit that specifically focuses on the history of Louisiana and New Orleans specifically. So we also have a lot of writers from the region that Anne sort of is able to play off of. In terms of hours, I believe they're 10 to 4.
Excellent. And another question for Nix, what sort of measures is the university taking to preserve the non-digital media in the Rice collection?
Sure. Well, I think transferring all of Anne's manuscripts into like acid-free folders and acid-free boxes, which generally helps the stability of the paper, keeping them in a climate-controlled environment also helps the stability of the collection. In terms of what I specifically did as preservation interventions, photocopying sticky notes that would fall off, extracting tape that was leaching acid, extracting staples, different rusty fasteners, paper clips, rubber bands, which essentially like literally just disintegrate. So there's a lot of sort of small preservation actions that we take. I think the biggest preservation action that we're taking at present is making sure that all of Anne's diaries are enclosed in their own boxes and being able to stand upright on the shelf, which will generally also help the preservation of their binding.
Interesting. All right, so now we have a question for Mara. What does amort sets mean on the set list?
Sorry, what does more sets mean on the set list?
They wrote it out 8. They saw it written on the set list at AMORT.
Yes. Okay, amort. It's amortized and amortized. So in television, if a set is in multiple episodes, usually, and again, I think if you ask anyone, everyone has a different barometer of what this means exactly, but usually if it's in 3 or more episodes, it's not just a recurring set. It doesn't come back just once, but it's kind of a foundational set for the show. That's an amort set. And so usually in budgeting for film and for television, I should say, there's an amortized budget, and there is a episodic budget. And so those kind of like core sets that kind of run throughout, exist in kind of one thing, and then everything else becomes a one-off.
Great. Another question from Mara. When you designed the buildings for the backlot, were they based on specific buildings from Storyville or original designs with architectural influences that were common at the time?
Because the main drag of Storyville was Basin Street, and that's the most documented. That was where the train line came in, and people kind of like the equivalent of Bourbon Street, where you'd see the girls in the windows, and it was the advertising for people to come off the train and get in. Because we didn't build Basin, we built the train line, and visual effects will be extending it. But the street that we built was Iberville, so it's perpendicular to Basin. Which was not as well documented. We didn't have as much kind of to go off of what exactly would have been there, but we did capture a few iconic places like Tom Anderson's saloon, the corner building, which is really famous in the Storyville photos. That's a building that we were pretty accurate on creating on the corner. And then there's 2 or 3 other buildings on the block that are pretty accurate recreations of actual buildings that were on Basin Street. And then the rest is kind of an amalgamation of period accurate architecture from the period.
Excellent. So possibly the same guest, they remain anonymous, asks another question from Mara. Is all the production documentation, set designs, costume designs, construction designs, research notes, etc., being archived? And if so, where?
Every show, it's a bit like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where all of the stuff gets boxed up, and literally both the physical elements of the show, but also the digital archives of all of this gets put on a website called Box. It gets boxed up, and it kind of disappears into the netherworld of whether or not a show is going to have a second season, whether it has to be reshot. But that's the only reason those archives or resources are held. And so we do all of this crazy work, and then it just kind of disappears. I keep all of it because I find there's a lot of overlap that can happen with when you're working in similar periods. But no, there's no source for this. Occasionally with the publicity world of film and television, some of that stuff will be made public, but there's so much of it. I mean, I think our department rap drive was multiple terabytes of data. So it's so much to go through.
Yeah, I can imagine. So another question for Nix. One of our viewers attendees is curious. Mara had talked about what brought her to New Orleans, and so they're wondering what brought you to New Orleans, Nix?
Well, I'm born and raised in New Orleans. I went to school in Boston, and then I came back. Having been in Boston for 4 years, I think the culture there is completely different from the culture of New Orleans, and I really missed and longed for that sense of connectivity and community that exists in New Orleans in a way that I think doesn't exist in other places, in that we just have a resilience and a sensitivity to the struggles of multiple people, regardless of who they are. So that's what always draws me to New Orleans.
Excellent. So another question for Nix. I am an MLIS student and interested in archives. Is there anything I can do or study to help work on Rice's materials in terms of preservation?
In terms of actually working on the collection is now available to the public, so there's no further work really to do on the collection besides wrapping up a few custom housing sort of aspects of the collection.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's fantastic that it's now open to the public and available. Someone else asks, and again for Nix, will the physical archives ever be digitized and made available online?
I cannot answer that question. It's highly dependent on many different factors, one of which is that digitization just takes a lot of time and labor and general curation to actually create digital surrogates of the collection in a way that people would understand like the physical collection as well. So I think that there's a possibility. I imagine that there's a slim chance that the entire collection is going to be digitized. But I imagine we'll do exhibits and also, provide digital assets. So
Fantastic.
kind of up in the air, but probable.
Yeah. So another question from Mara. Considering how important the source material is to you, do you often have disagreements about the level of detail you say is needed?
That's a tough one. I think, I've worked on several shows that are, so connected to the history that's being presented that there has to be a level of authenticity and rigor that takes a backseat to the story and the characters. For example, I worked on a show called Mrs. America that was about the women's movement in the 70s. And so I think for a show like that, you really just want to present as much of the realism of the time and everything that was happening and the detail. Like for me, you could never have enough real detail injected into that. For a show like Interview, I think what's a gift as a designer is that it has this foundation in the writing of both the novel and the screenplay of really incredible detail and texture of the city, but it's also fantasy. This is a story about vampires. And so there's a little bit of flexibility there. And I think that the other thing to think about with this story is that it's a memory piece. Louis is telling this story. So there's also a little bit of bias from the narrator of what that period was and what you're living through and romanticizing some things and not others. And I think that combination of things for Interview is such a gift, because as someone who has a history in architecture, who has a history of being a fan of Anne Rice, I think that there's a certain level of rigor to detail that kind of is going to be inherent to whatever I bring to the table. But there's also, again, because this is a collaborative art form, there has to be a little bit of malleability and flexibility to be able to tell the story at hand. And this was a really fun project to have that combination.
Great. So that kind of leads actually into a question I had for you, Mara, which was how do you coordinate and prioritize in your decision-making process between historical accuracy and fictional accuracy? If those two things were ever coming into conflict, did you have some kind of guiding principle that would help you decide which you would be more faithful?
Sometimes it's driven by budget and time, and sometimes things are driven by, again, because of the medium of filmmaking, with how a shot has to be constructed. It's like as an example, the interior of Lestat's townhouse or Gallier house, the kind of subtle changes that we made, like we had to make it a little bit bigger and added doors in places where they didn't necessarily exist because we needed people to come and go from different things. So there's a little bit of using the script as Bible to kind of gestate and gel what the built world is going to be. And I think you could probably ask any producer, director, or writer on the show. I tend to be, I'm not a wilting wallflower when it comes to my opinions about what's important or not. And I think, if there's something that I thought was a really incredible detail of time or place or of relevance to Anne's writing, I would fight for it as much as it was possible to do that. But it is always kind of a dance and a balance to figure out how to do those things. And I think I always go back to what would I as a viewer want? And the shows that I like the most are the ones where the world feels all encompassing. You don't question it. And sometimes it makes you want to learn more about that time or place because you've seen or discovered something that you didn't necessarily know. And so I think a lot of the times, because I do so much research, I will often kind of suggest things that could be happening in the background, just to kind of liven things up and situate ourselves a bit more in time and place.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question, Nix, what was your favorite part of the collection, or what did you most enjoy working with as you processed it?
The fan mail, hands down. There's just so many interesting pieces of fan mail that really speak to Anne's impact on her audience and also her audience's impact on her. And in her diaries is also like writing down fan comments that she thinks are relevant to her work. And I remember one journal entry where she is livid about the fact that one of her fans has figured out the ending to her novel and how she's going to get out of that ending now that it's been revealed. So I love that there's this interplay between her fans and herself. And it's very fascinating to see the gamut of, historical researchers, scholars, people who are very clearly invested in the history of literature, I would say, versus people who are just very obsessed with vampires and want to know why and how Anne got into this avenue, and are just generally fascinated by that. And then also people who want to be a part of her universe. So people who want to be cast in the Interview with the Vampire movie, people who want to work for her, people who want to engage with her fan club, people who want donations from her. There's just all these people who are really, really invested in who she is. And I think the fan mail is one clear avenue where you see pretty much every aspect of how Anne Rice has touched American culture, and like specifically like the Southern Gothic tradition and New Orleans culture.
Amazing. I also have a question for you, Nix. So as someone who is so clearly very engaged with history and archival research in her work, do you think that this passion and this mode of working influenced the sheer volume of documents that she left behind, that Anne Rice left behind? Do you think she was trying, in a sense, to archive herself on some level?
Well, I think Anne is clearly in collaboration with archivists, museum professionals, and librarians to find resources. So she's constantly sending letters to different institutions, just generally trying to get a sense of what they have and what she can use to build her world itself. What I find really fascinating is that both Brown and LSU reached out to her and basically was like, hey, we would love to talk to you about possibly acquiring your manuscript collection. And at the time that these letters are being sent to her, Anne does not have any real concept of what an archive is or what an archival collection entails in terms of what she can give. But she has these conversations with archivists specifically about archival work. And I would say that that would definitely inform Anne moving forward in having a very meticulously organized, a very meticulously labeled, and just like a very meticulously put together collection where a lot of the choices that she made were very clear to me off bat, which is not the case with pretty much any archival collection that I've processed. So I think Anne was really a breath of fresh air in that she clearly had a goal and intention for her collection.
Wonderful. So I think we've got time for 2 questions now. So first, one more for Nix. or have you become aware through the archive of any time that Anne might have clashed with the brackets, ridiculous, close brackets, stigma against women writing Gothic lit? The person asking the question points out that even though it was invented by a woman. I'm wondering if you could comment on this.
I personally have not seen it, but I will say that, again, because archival processing is at a top level, I haven't read every single item that exists in the collection. So it's entirely possible that she's talked about these things. I just personally haven't seen it. I will say that Anne, in her diaries, is very specifically talking about gender and the impact that gender has had on her personal sense of self and her personal career. And a lot of that is that she feels in some ways encased by the sense of womanhood that has been impressed upon her. And as someone who becomes the breadwinner of her family and becomes, you know, this icon of literature, she's constantly running up against clear gender roles that just do not make sense for her and the tone of her life. So I think what's really interesting in her diaries is getting a sense of how her career and her interpersonal life sort of connect. And I imagine that there's probably more related to that question there.
Absolutely. So fascinating. So the last question is maybe an obvious one. Several people are wondering, Mara, when will the show air?
There is not a set release date, but it should be coming out this fall. So look forward to this when it's not so hot out.
Excellent. Well, let's give another round of virtual applause to Nix Mendy and Mara LePere-Schloop. So on behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, I would like to thank Nix and Mara for speaking with us this evening.